Environmental liability is changing. International expansion. There is a version of international expansion that companies have been running for years. Enter a market, acquire an asset, or greenfield a facility, navigate local permitting, and manage environmental compliance, the same way you would at home. Maybe a little looser, if you're being honest about it. That version is getting expensive. Across multiple regions, the regulatory and legal architecture around environmental liability is tightening in ways that are changing the risk profile of cross-border growth. What companies inherit when they acquire assets, what they're responsible for under emerging due diligence frameworks, and what they're exposed to when environmental conditions deteriorate after entry. These questions now carry financial consequences that most deal teams aren't fully pricing in. The due diligence gap is real. Environmental due diligence in cross-border transactions has historically focused on known contamination, site-specific compliance history, and whether local permits are in order. That scope worked reasonably well when liability stayed local. It doesn't anymore. The European Union's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which entered into force in 2024 and begins phasing in obligations starting in 2027, requires large companies operating in or supplying into EU markets to identify, prevent, and address adverse environmental impacts across their value chains, including upstream suppliers and downstream partners. The directive carries civil liability exposure. Companies that fail to meet their due diligence obligations can be held liable for resulting harm under conditions that have no equivalent in most existing corporate compliance frameworks. For multinationals with EU operations or EU-bound supply chains, this changes the scope of pre-entry assessment fundamentally. It is no longer sufficient to evaluate a target's internal environmental record. You are also buying into their supplier relationships, their sourcing geography, and whatever liability sits in that chain. Inherited liability is the underpriced risk. The more immediate problem for companies already operating internationally is what they absorbed in prior transactions and may not have fully accounted for. Central and Eastern Europe carries a significant legacy contamination burden from decades of industrial activity under regulatory frameworks that bore little resemblance to current standards. Companies that acquired manufacturing assets in those markets during the privatization waves of the 1990s and early 2000s often did so with environmental assessments that reflected what liability looked like then, not what it looks like now. As EU member states strengthen enforcement of the Environmental Liability Directive and adopt more aggressive remediation standards, that inherited exposure is being revalued. Mexico presents a different version of the same problem. Environmental enforcement under PROFEPA has become more active in certain industrial sectors, particularly in manufacturing corridors that operate under USMCA supply chain relationships with U.S. buyers. Companies that assumed Mexican facilities carried lower compliance risk than their U.S. counterparts are encountering a regulatory environment that is less predictable than it was 5 years ago, not more. In both cases, the liability didn't change. The enforcement environment around it did. The valuation problem, nobody is talking about loudly. What makes this moment different is that environmental liability is beginning to influence deal economics in ways that weren't showing up in valuations even 3 years ago. Lenders financing cross-border acquisitions are asking more specific questions about environmental contingent liabilities, particularly in markets with evolving regulatory regimes or pending remediation obligations. In some transactions, environmental exposure that would previously have been handled with a standard indemnity basket is now being treated as a deal structure question, affecting price, escrow requirements, or the feasibility of the transaction itself. Insurance markets are adjusting in parallel. Environmental liability coverage for international assets has become more expensive and more conditional over the last 2 years, with underwriters applying greater scrutiny to assets in regions where regulatory direction is unclear or accelerating. For companies that have historically used environmental insurance to bridge the gap between what due diligence found and what it might have missed, that bridge is narrowing. The companies still modeling environmental liability as a fixed, knowable cost at close are underpricing a variable that is moving against them. Geography is not a buffer anymore. One of the operating assumptions embedded in many international growth strategies is that entering markets with less developed environmental regulatory frameworks provides some degree of insulation from the compliance intensity of home markets. That assumption is being dismantled in stages. The EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which began its transitional phase in 2023, is the clearest example. It functions as a tariff on carbon-intensive imports, and it effectively exports EU environmental standards to suppliers operating outside EU borders. For companies producing in markets with lower carbon pricing and selling into Europe, the cost differential is shrinking in ways that weren't in the original market entry model. Similar dynamics are emerging in trade relationships involving the US and UK, where supply chain due diligence legislation is expanding the environmental accountability of buyers for conditions in their supplier base. Geography does not insulate you from liability when the liability is attached to the product reaching the market, not to the facility that made it. What the exposed companies have in common. Across the range of liability scenarios, a pattern emerges in how companies end up on the wrong side of these situations. They conducted environmental due diligence as a compliance exercise rather than a risk quantification exercise. They assumed that local standards represented the ceiling of their exposure rather than the floor. They didn't model regulatory trajectory, only current enforcement posture. And they structured transactions with environmental indemnities calibrated to what they found, not to what could emerge as standards evolve over the asset's operating life. The companies managing this well are approaching environmental liability in cross-border contexts the same way they approach political risk, as a dynamic variable with a direction of travel, not a static condition to be assessed once and filed. That means running pre-entry regulatory trajectory analysis alongside traditional due diligence. It means stress testing valuations against tightening scenarios, not just current conditions. And it means getting outside counsel and environmental advisors who know the specific market, not generalists applying a template developed in a different regulatory context. The math is changing. International expansion has always carried environmental risk. What's new is that the frameworks for assigning and enforcing that liability are maturing, converging, and in several key markets accelerating faster than corporate development teams are tracking. The companies that adjust their pre-entry processes now will have cleaner books and better options. The ones that don't will spend the next decade managing liabilities they thought they'd priced and finding out they hadn't. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.